I'm George Galloway, and I present كلمة on Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. كلمة means free word. That's what I speak. So كلمة is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Mayadeen television. Welcome to كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television. Coming to you from London, but discussing Africa, particularly East Africa, and particularly what we call the Horn of Africa. My now 40-year-old daughter, mother of 5, her first actual words that she spoke were Ethiopian government, because she heard her father almost every day and often during the day talking about the then Ethiopian government 40 years ago. I spent a lot of time working in the famine-stricken regions of the Horn of Africa, but the famine was man-made. It was not just a drought. It was war and terror everywhere. It was a complete calamity, and I have never been able to forget the searing experiences of that time. If I tell you that the only time I've been bombed from the air, lying flat out on the earth, trying to push my nose literally into the dirt, that happened to me in Eritrea. The aircraft dropping the bombs then was a Soviet aircraft, but the bombs were American bombs, as we could later see from the fragments which tore into the civilians all around me. I watched as 2 children died on a table, and ITN, the British television crew, filmed it at the time. I called those bombs at the time vodka cola bombs, because they were a product of the shifting allegiances of the then 2 superpowers in the world. The United States was desperately trying to dislodge the then government of Ethiopia, led by Colonel Mengistu, an ally of Cuba and the Soviet Union in particular. America, and I'm not making this up, China, were supporting the TPLF, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, on the principle that my enemy's enemy is my friend, no doubt, as the TPLF then, though not now, were Maoists. They supported the revolutionary line of Chairman Mao Zedong, although when the Albanian dictator Enver Hoxha broke with China, rather foolishly you might think, they followed the line of Enver Hoxha, thus becoming the only pro-Albanian armed outfit operating anywhere on the African continent. There is a new scramble for Africa going on, and the Horn of Africa is far from immune to that scramble. Just like in the 19th century when the big powers were scrambling for colonies in the continent of Africa, now in the 21st century they're scrambling for influence, for invisible control, or scarcely visible control in one country after another throughout the great continent. Because, hey, it turns out Africa isn't poor after all, it's vastly rich, and vastly rich in many of the raw materials and commodities that people in the West desperately need. The United States has formed a whole new AFRICOM, the African Command of American military power. France is trying to reconquer some of its previous colonies. The British are, even the Belgians are in there, though they were the most bloody and most disastrous of all of the European colonial powers. Let's focus for a minute on Ethiopia. Once again, Russia is supporting the Ethiopian government, which is now supported by its former foe in Eritrea. China is also supporting the Ethiopian government, and the United States is once again supporting the former Maoists of the TPLF. I saw in Bloomberg News a call for the American army to occupy Ethiopia in order to stabilize the situation. What could possibly go wrong? It's as if they haven't seen the movie Black Hawk Down. Which brings me to Somalia, where, of course, all the big powers and some new powers from the Middle East are deeply involved in trying to gain control of events in Somalia. Then there's the coup d'etat in Sudan, where the civilian government has been swept away in yet another military coup. The Americans say they were not told about the coup, that they are against the coup, although it happened the day after one of their most senior officials from the State Department was actually there meeting the new coup leader in Sudan. Sudan, of course, vitally affects events in Egypt, and luckily we have a very great expert on events in Egypt, indeed the whole region, with us today, and a man from the region whose knowledge is second to none. So as always, I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. Let me introduce our guests, the distinguished experts. First of all, Dr. Abdullah Hamouda is a writer and journalist. He's an Egyptian academic and an analyst of the Middle East and Africa, and a member of the prestigious Royal Institute for International Affairs at Chatham House in London. Doctor, welcome back to the show. How was my summary of events there? Did I get anything wrong?
You get it right, actually. You hit the nail on the head. The situation is turbulent in the whole region. Ethiopia is the last addition, just competing with what happened in the Sudan lately. Egypt feels uneasy about what is going on in the Horn of Africa because it brings about an unpredictable course of events. People say that the Egyptians are happy that Ethiopia is going through a difficult time. This is not necessarily right. The Egyptian people feel that uncertainty in Ethiopia could be harmful to Egypt, and feel also that what Abiy Ahmed tried to sell the Ethiopian by going about the dam in the way he got and creating friction with both Sudan and Egypt as a national project to unify the country. But the advent of his election with no participation from the opposition and his winning by 90% of the vote.
Egyptians are familiar with these kind of votes.
Of course, but in the case of Ethiopia, it is a joke. And it has brought about what we have seen right now. And actually, we feel very sorry for the Ethiopian people.
That's a good point. I mean, some things never change. And one of the things that never changes is the enormous suffering of the ordinary people, some of the poorest people on earth, in the midst of this swirl of geopolitics and war.
Yes, absolutely right. People in Egypt, when they see what is happening now, they say that even nature failed Abiy Ahmed by the huge rainfall in the season, which made the water override the dam and bring lots of water to both Sudan and Egypt. And now his failure to resolve the problem of weaving together that great mosaic of ethnicity, nationality, religion, culture in the whole country of Ethiopia, and his falling into the trap of the internal politics, because he has focused on the geopolitics, and everyone from the superpowers or the great powers in the world today try to use him to their own advantage, not necessarily to his country's advantage.
What do you think is the present United States role in all these affairs?
In Egypt, they see the United States position as trying to appear to be helping Egypt, but in the same time trying to coerce Egypt into resolving the problem of the Renaissance Dam within the context of supplying Israel with water. And no one in Egypt talks about that, because no government in Egypt, whatever, can do that and remain in power for one day. The Egyptian people will never accept it, and I think the present government is aware of that.
And lastly, for the moment, what's the United States' role in the coup in the Sudan?
The movement for change and reform, they will not acquiesce to the American wish or pressure to normalize relation with the Sudan. And the civilian government has accepted it with a pinch of salt in order to continue with reforms and get their name, their country's name off the terror list and of the kind of boycott from the international financial institutions controlled by the United States, of course. But the people who really don't have any qualm about normalizing with Israel are the army. And America is happy to have a dictator at her own side rather than have someone to discuss. They don't want friends, they want subservience.
What do you think, Sahel Yusuf Ali? You're a journalist and broadcaster. You're also a political activist on Somalian affairs. You're the chairman of Gashan, a non-profit organization offering advocacy, information and advice to disadvantaged people. There can be few more disadvantaged peoples in the world today than those in the Horn of Africa.
Thank you, George. Really, there are so many disadvantaged people in the southern hemisphere and also in northern hemisphere, those who fled their countries and came into what they thought was a heaven, but turned out to be El Dorado, a fictitious country where the wealth is supposed to be, like Western Europe. There are more disadvantaged people everywhere you go. At the moment, as you discussed it clearly in this situation in the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia is at war with itself. Somalia have many times came to the edge and was about to go back into the situations of the 1990s when the civil war broke out and the country's military disintegrated along tribal lines. And you have seen what is happening in Sudan and what might happen in other countries in the region. All this is an indication that we are not fighting these wars ourselves. Other people are fighting their wars over us. And mainly these powerful nations like United States and others are now responsible for this increased instability in the region. Example, Ethiopia, if you look at the shifting allegiances of these nations and the way things are happening is a testimony that we are, as Africans, nothing other than a tool of somebody that can be used at any time for any purpose. And it's a sad situation to be in. We have nominally taken our independence from colonial powers, but we are not free countries. We are not free countries. I give you an example. At the moment, the Western-backed government in Somalia is directed, advised, instructed by the Western donors. They
And some Gulf countries also.
And thank you very much. My opinion about these Gulf states is they are someone else's tools. In Ethiopia, you have seen Tigrayans who born in the mid-1970s, who felt marginalized and who started forming an army of themselves in order to bring about change. And then they let that built up with other alliances, and they led to topple the Marxist regime in the 1991. They have been in power for 30 years. Many see their 30-year period as period of opportunities and progress. But in reality, they were repressive regimes that internally created one of the worst humanitarian crises, invading in Somalia, committing war crimes, never allowing to mend fences with Eritrea. One of the many reasons that they did not cooperate or work with Abiy, the prime minister, who himself has been intelligence officer, who were part of TPLF-dominated government for all these years. One of the reasons is that he reconciled Ethiopia's differences with his neighboring Eritrea. One of the things they didn't want. And as soon as he came into the power, he was seen as a reformist, but he was disillusioned with the Tigrayan domination of the country's affairs. So he started to work on draining power and influence of Tigrayans from the country, from the state. And in a series of actions he took have infuriated the Tigrayans. They went to their stronghold, and what happened was they defied his orders to postpone the elections and started to attack military camps, and he ordered federal army offenses using Amhara militia that he deployed into some parts of the Tigray region, and Eritrean alliance army that also went into the northern part of Tigray, and also some unknown number of Somali conscripts that were sent by the Somali government, trained in Eritrea, and later used it for the war in Tigray. At the beginning, all these alliances fighting alongside the Abiy's army have brought the fall of Mekelle, the regional capital of Tigray. But people thought it was a victory, but in reality, it was tactical withdrawal of these battle-hardened Tigrayans. They went into mountainous region, came back, and Ethiopia's army, which is estimated to be 20 units, 7 of them were neutralized. A major defeat led to the capture of the strategic town of Mekelle and other key towns. What you have seen here, it is a nation of 112 million people with 80 different ethnic groups that has nothing in common in terms of language, religion, culture. I give you an example. I'm a Somali ethnic background, and there is a region called Ogaden. 100% of the people, inhabitants of this region, are Somalians, whose region have been wrongly annexed to Ethiopia by the colonialist powers who rule it. They dream to one day become a free nation. The danger at the moment...
They were fighting in the 1980s also.
The collapse of Somalia, the very reason that we have collapsed as a state was the strong military regime of Siad Barre, who tried to retake the lost territory from the Ethiopians. The thing is that the danger that is coming at the moment, Tigrayans would not have alone been able to make the progress they made in the front line. Now the war is shifting in their favor. But I think the problem that is coming is that they have allied with Oromo Liberation Army, I think. Oromo Liberation Army, after they started to engage in the front line, things have changed. There was advances day after day towards the capital. And they belong, the Tigrayans are only 7% of the Ethiopian population. The largest ethnic groups are the Amharas and the Oromos. By going into alliance with the Oromos, it is impossible for Abiy to stay in power. So at the moment, what is happening, these people cannot bring peace to their countries. Things are not in their own hands. Things are in the hands of these, players, other players, foreigners who are there. The United States, the Russians you mentioned, the Chinese, the Gulf states that have taken the last 15 years a role to act like superpowers and engage every activity in the region. So what is happening here? People who look at the continent from outside and inside, we are worried about the fall of Ethiopia and what might come out. I think the alliance between Tigrayans, if they ever have chance to get back into power, with Oromos, would be a great factor that brings this region to its knees.
Well, I told you that it was complicated, and yet it's actually quite simple. The big powers that did so much to hold Africa back so they could loot it in the 19th and even much of the 20th century are still at their games. And they can always rely on sectarian division, on people's failure to recognize their national consciousness and their national interest rather than their own sectional one. In the second half of the show, we'll be talking to two distinguished experts from the United States, as well, of course, as my distinguished guests here in London. So stay tuned for the second part of كلمة. You're watching كلمة with me, George Galloway, on Mayadeen television, coming from London, but discussing Africa, in particular, the Horn of Africa. We heard from two experienced and very wise Africans in the first half of the show. Let's see what we can put together by way of international perspective. Professor Alex de Waal from Boston in the United States is British but living and teaching in the US. He's the executive director of the World Peace Foundation at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and was working on the Horn of Africa for almost 40 years. Let's hear from the professor.
You're very welcome.
Professor, why is there now such instability in the East African region? What has caused this situation?
I think the major change we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is that what was an emergent system, a Pax Africana, built around the norms, principles, and institutions of the African Union, and a Pax Ethiopica, built around the strategy for development, diplomacy, and a hegemonic role in the region played by Ethiopia, has unraveled. And what we've seen in its place is the tide of transactional politics, of the politics conducted on the basis of bartering political rewards, political allegiances for material benefits. And in the geopolitical context, what we have seen is that the Middle East Security Alliance of the United States, favored states in the Middle East, Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, those states and their mode of politics, which is highly militarized, highly transactional, has taken over and absorbed the Horn of Africa into their hinterland and turned it into, as we've seen in other parts of the greater Middle East, a zone of chaos, violence, and ethnic conflict.
In your opinion, who's behind these changes? I mean, domestically and externally.
I think it's a mixture of the grand sweep of politics, the dismantling of institutionalized governance in favor of a highly deregulated, ultra-liberal form of politics and governance, in which political power becomes a commodity to be bought and sold in the market. And then that has been driven in part by what is shared in common between the United States, Russia, and China, which is this increasingly transactional approach that regards other parts of the world as pawns, as players in which their political games can be played. And on the side of the United States, the extent in which the US has handed off responsibility for its political and security strategies to its favored players in the Middle East. And then within the region of the Horn of Africa itself, we see a breed of leaders who are highly opportunistic, able to exploit the niches in this regional political market that emerge. So we see Abiy Ahmed, who is a rather unskilled player at this, who has been leading Ethiopia into disaster. Isaias Afwerki, who is a highly ruthless player. Mohamed Farmajo in Somalia, who is in between. And then in Sudan, General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who took over the kleptocratic system of his predecessor, Omar al-Bashir, and has been clamoring for the opportunity to step into his shoes, an opportunity he has now been taken with his coup d'etat last month.
Well, you mentioned the president, but he won the Nobel Peace Prize for bringing about the end of a ruinous, decades-long conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Why do you think he's now taken a walk down the wrong side?
The award of the Nobel Prize was both misguided in that he didn't deserve it at the time, and doubly misguided in that his personal characteristic meant that he turned what should have been a great asset into a liability. It wasn't deserved at the time because it was given to him for an agreement he made with Isaias Afwerki, the dictator of Eritrea. Now, the peace agreement that came about was one that had two features. Number one, it had been actually worked out by the Organization of African Unity in 2000. And so the African Continental Organization, which became the AU, the African Union, was the custodian of that. He didn't take that peace agreement to the AU for what would be the normal procedures of blessing of the AU to say, let us be transparent, let us make sure this is a step towards true peace and stability, democratization, etc. Instead, it was a secret deal between him and Isaias Afwerki, the dictator, which was taken first to Abu Dhabi and then to Jeddah for blessing by the regional powers of the Middle East that are not fundamentally interested in the norms and principles and institutions of peace. And then Abiy himself took this as a blessing, took this as the ultimate sort of secular sainthood, and refused to enter or to continue negotiations with his internal political adversaries and rivals, and instead thought that his word was now a form of holy writ, and he has had this vision himself as being chosen by God to be the next king of Ethiopia. And so that fed his ego, fed his hubris, and fed his sadly all too predictable leadership of Ethiopia into the abyss of war and destruction.
Professor, let me raise what is the $64,000 question, as we used to call it, when 64,000 was a lot of dollars. Is the United States behind the TPLF?
There is a highly sophisticated, very energetic media campaign by the Ethiopia government to say that the United States is taking a side against Ethiopia in this war. And frankly, it's nonsense. I don't have any remit for the US government. I think it makes a lot of mistakes. I think on this case, it has actually been pretty balanced. And frankly, the idea that it is supporting TPLF is nonsense. In fact, to the contrary, the US government was extremely enthusiastic about Abiy Ahmed and his reforms, and went out of its way to reject the developmental state of his predecessor, but one, Meles Zenawi, who was somebody who tried to steer a middle course between the US and China. And in fact, it was that independence of Ethiopia under the previous, more socialist inclined leadership. The United States, in fact, embraced Abiy Ahmed as a progressive, capitalist-leaning, pro-Western leader when he came to power. It was, in fact, more distrustful of his predecessors, and especially Meles Zenawi, who died some few years ago, who had deliberately tried to distance the Ethiopian political and developmental strategy from the American sphere.
Dr. Abdullah, what did you think of that Anglo-American perspective?
I think the United States and the United Kingdom, they have some kind of thread which connected them together.
Chains, I'd call it, rather than a thread, but go on.
Well, the Americans don't see it as a chain, actually. Probably the British side sees it as a chain, but the Americans see it as a thread. Yeah. And they act together in a way that can maximize the return for them at the expense of other competition. But at the same time, they stumble. They cannot play safe all the time. They stumble and make mistakes and not assess the situation in the correct way. What's going on in Ethiopia now, I think, will prove them somehow rash in their assessment, because Russia and China are working with the other side. The Tigray are not that strong unless the Oromo come in full with them. Other ethnic groups are not sympathetic. They are not active against the federal government, but they are not sympathetic towards the federal government. The situation is really obscure. No one can predict it completely.
And of course, even the fall of Addis Ababa would not be the beginning of the end, but merely the end of the beginning.
Absolutely right.
Decades more of civil conflict.
Absolutely right. But within the whole of Africa in general, it looks like major countries in the continent of Africa have been castrated in a way that they cannot play a leading, effective role unless they work within the strategy of the United States.
Yes, which has been subcontracted, the professor concedes,
yes,
to Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates.
Absolutely.
None of them actually African powers. Sahel, he mentioned the C word, China. Is part of this about the United States terror of China catching it and about to overtake it?
In face of the Ethiopian reforms to build the country's infrastructure and lay down foundations for a state that is productive, a state that is a breadbasket for the rest of the continent. In face of that, the Chinese were the chosen partners for Ethiopia. And I think the Ethiopian problem simply can be looked at. The American is unhappy about any power in Ethiopia that steers its direction to China and tries to do real business with. I think the Chinese said many times they are investing in these countries, building infrastructure, roads, hospitals, schools, railways, everything. But there is no military foot that belongs to China that is visibly there, like the Russians used to do. We were a Russian ally, and we had a strained relationship with the West. And we wanted to take a missing territory of our country, Ogaden, from the Ethiopians. We never worried about the way now we worried, because there is no balance of power.
No, although if the fate of Ethiopia is as you fear that it's going to be, in other words, the government falling, Addis Ababa overrun by two united, essentially ethnic armies, leaving at least half the country unrepresented, China and Russia will have to step up to the plate, won't they?
Definitely, they have to step up. Otherwise, whatever you do for these would be a wasted investment, because these people, the Americans, have a history of carrying out what is regime changes. They can remove you.
They'll either steal what you've invested or destroy it. Let's hear more from the U.S. Thomas Mountain from Virginia is a journalist, commentator, and East African analyst. You might think that's strange from Virginia, but in fact, he lived in Eritrea for the last 15 years. He just recently moved back to the US, and his wife is a veteran of the independence war in Eritrea. Thomas.
Thank you.
Thomas, there's really now drastic instability in the whole region of East Africa. We've got a coup in the Sudan, we've got civil war in Somalia, we have got civil war in Ethiopia. Who's behind all this?
Well, right now, the critical thing that's happening is the counter coup against the terrorist organization called the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF for short, in Ethiopia. Because historically, Ethiopia has been the US policeman on the beat in the Horn of Africa, which is a strategically critical area for the United States. And in November 4th in 2020, the TPLF launched a coup attempt to gain power in Ethiopia. And in the course of this coup, they tried to seize a military base, the largest military base in Ethiopia, which is in Tigray, their home province, and which is the major stockpile of weapons in Ethiopia. To understand how all this came to be and to the background of all this, and we need to go back to April of 2018. And at that time, the United States, what we call a national security establishment, was in a kind of a period of chaos because they were going between the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, had been fired by Trump, and they'd been replaced by Mike Pompeo, a congressman from Kansas, who had been head of the CIA. And so the CIA, the State Department, was in kind of a period of chaos there. Now, Tillerson was an oil executive and Pompeo was a politician from Kansas, and neither of them knew anything about Africa. So in the meantime, they basically turned over control of what was going on in Africa to a long-time, very experienced diplomat named Donald Yamamoto, who had 30 years background, most of it as the US ambassador to Ethiopia. And Donald Yamamoto recognized the fact that in 2018, Ethiopia was about to implode and splinter into ethnic states due to the divide and conquer strategy that TPLF had been employing to try to stay in power. So Donald Yamamoto engineered a meeting with Eritrean President Isaias Afwerki, flew to Asmara in April of 2018 and finalized a deal where Ethiopia and Eritrea had come to peace. And this allowed Dr. Abiy Ahmed to come to power in Ethiopia. And part of the deal was that the TPLF would withdraw from Addis and go back to their home province of Tigray. So this deal was basically a regime change, a peaceful revolution, as I call it at the time. Today, you've got the TPLF launched a military offensive against the Ethiopian army, which has been struggling to rebuild itself. Now, the Eritreans pulled out of Tigray immediately after the capture of Mekelle and allowed the Ethiopian army to have to, rebuild itself from the ground up, which is what's been going on. And it's been difficult and it's been slow, but the Ethiopians have rallied and they've been now, in spite of all the propaganda on the Western media, and I advise people, don't believe anything you see or hear in the Western media. It's all lies. The Ethiopian military has got the Tigrayans, the TPLF on their back foot. Many of the places, the cities that the TPLF claimed they'd captured, which were never really captured, were contested. They have now been defeated at and driven from. And just the fact that they're being quiet about what's going on is pretty much an indication that they're on the back foot. So I'm expecting that maybe by the end of this year, the TPLF will be defeated.
Well, I don't know about you, Thomas, but I can quite clearly see the Western American footprint in these conflicts. If I'm right, what does the U.S. seek to gain from them?
Why is the U.S., the national security establishment in the United States supporting the TPLF? Because they have been. The CIA has been giving them satellite imagery, where to attack. They've been providing support to them directly, political support through their allies within the human rights movements. I call the human rights mob at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and the national security establishment plants that they have in the UN. They've been providing cover for the TPLF. Now, TPLF is supported by the US because Dr. Abiy has made it very clear that he is going to move Ethiopia in the same direction Eritrea is at. That he just won this massive electoral victory. 85% of the people voted for him. The Ethiopian people want Abiy to transform their country from the desperately poor, famine, and disease-ridden country it's been, war-torn country it's been, into a modern society. So Abiy Ahmed has pledged to make Ethiopia self-sufficient in food, self-sufficient in energy, and politically independent. And this is a threat not only to the United States, but to the EU. So, and one of the planks of Abiy Ahmed's electoral platform was he was going to nationalize all the land in Ethiopia. Now, this has been said to be done before in Ethiopia, but this is a threat to the investment particularly the European Union. You see, the EU is dependent upon sucking the blood of Africa to maintain the high standard of living of their people. They've been pretty much, they can't control, they can't super exploit Latin America and Asia like they used to. The only place they can literally loot and plunder is in Africa. For example, Anglo-American Gold has been running one of the biggest gold mines in Africa and Tanzania, and they only pay Tanzania a 4% royalty. Now, Eritrea gets a 40% royalty for their gold mines. Now, if Europe has to start paying a fair share of the exploitation they're doing in Africa, they're not going to be able to continue to maintain the high standard of living, the social security and the education and the medical care that they provide to their people. And they're already facing discontent in Europe. And if they can't continue to buy their people off, they're in serious problem. And if they lose control of Africa, it's going to provoke an enormous crisis in the EU, and their leaders know this. That's why they've been so ruthless in opposing Abiy Ahmed, because Abiy Ahmed has made it clear, whether we understand it or not, the national security establishments in the United States and the EU know that Abiy Ahmed is taking Ethiopia down the path that Eritrea has taken, to be an independent, sovereign nation, self-sufficient, to break the bonds of aid and beggary that they've been foisted upon them by the TPLF for these past 28 years. So they're determined to see the end of Abiy Ahmed.
Well, look, here's what I suspect. Is this new situation in Ethiopia connected to China? Is it connected to China's investments, its Belt and Road Initiative, its total relationship with the Ethiopian government? Is that why the United States has begun to move against a man that they formerly seemed to admire?
Well, China is about to start a new major gas pipeline from the Ethiopian region of Ogaden. And China does have a lot of investments in Ethiopia. And China and Russia has been protecting Ethiopia in the Security Council. But as far as the rivalry with China, I would say that would be more something you would have seen maybe in Sudan, South Sudan, because China has the only Chinese owned and operated oil fields in Africa is in South Sudan. And so I don't see China-U.S. rivalry being that critical. I see more the U.S. being threatened by a loss of military control of the Bab al-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, the straits between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, through which the trade between Asia and Europe passes, which are the two largest trading partners in the world. The U.S. is no longer economically dominant, but their military control is critical. And I've long predicted that the day the U.S. loses control of the Bab al-Mandeb, it marks the beginning of the end of the U.S. empire. Now, in Egypt, the U.S. pays the salaries of the Egyptian military to the tune of $1.5 billion. Basically, the CIA pays the Egyptian military. And that allows them to control the Suez Canal. But the other choke point in this trade route on the Red Sea is Bab al-Mandeb. And that is a major problem. Ethiopia has been the U.S. policeman on the beat. They've been able to control Bab al-Mandeb through the invasion of Somalia. And but that's all up for grabs now. Ethiopia used to be a home for a large U.S. military intelligence gathering operation. They've all been kicked out by Abiy Ahmed. And the U.S. is worried about all this.
Dr. Abdullah, that was quite an apocalyptic view from the United States. Doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean it's wrong. How would you calibrate the strategic importance to the United States of the Horn of Africa?
I think the United States is trying at a point of its power waning geopolitically to try and say, I'm here and I could do things. But unfortunately, they cannot do things the right way. They can do something, but we cannot do it the right way. The problem is that the Chinese trying to trick the Americans in a way that undermines the American policy. The Chinese, as Sohail, as he was talking, they try to invest in Africa, but they avoid the projection of power outside Southeast Asia, as if to assure people that they are not trying to get a hold on their economy and their destiny. But in reality, the Chinese are, in the way they build the projects in Africa, they adopt, or anywhere, they adopt the policy of BOOT, build, own, operate, and then transfer, which means that they keep the deed of the project in their hand until they get their money back, as if they are pawnbroking the country itself. But this is still, it is a softer power than the American hegemony economically, imposing certain course of development or financing a project in order to get the benefit of it themselves. Unfortunately, the Americans are here to lose, even if it doesn't appear in the long run. The Americans, the Chinese play the long hand and wait for the American to stumble.
That usually works, of course. They're now sitting in Bagram Air Base in Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
The United States ran away and left it.
Leaving Qatar to look after their own affairs and Turkey to provide the soldiers in the airport, exactly. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it looks gloomy all the way around, actually. And I felt somehow concerned about what the last speaker mentioned about a $1.5 billion military aid to Egypt. That raises in my mind a very dangerous and important question. How much the Americans could say within the Egyptian decision making in return for that money they pay. And I see that the Egyptians are in the geopolitical framework, they are trying to play a way of being with you but not fully with you. They participated in the American-led NATO exercise in the Black Sea in the vicinity of Russia, which people say that it is antagonized Russia to vote against the Egyptian wish at the United Nations Security Council. But at the same time, the Egyptians did not participate in the Red Sea exercises led by the American again in the Red Sea, which is much more important to Egypt. I find this somehow perplexing and mixing the cards all the way around.
Perplexing is the word. As he's come up already in the show, Chairman Mao, definitely prematurely, back in the 1960s, said that the United States was a paper tiger. It wasn't in the 1960s. It still isn't in 2021. But it's an old tiger. Many of its teeth have fallen out, and bigger tigers are now at large in the jungle. I've been George Galloway. This has been كلمة حرة. I hope you enjoyed the show.